Hi, welcome to the Elle Russ Show, where I deliver content intended to inspire, educate, and motivate. Engage with me online at elleruss.com and on social media. Enjoy the show.
Today, my guest is Brad Stulberg. He's an internationally known expert on human performance, well-being, and sustainable success. He's the author of The Practice of Groundedness, a transformative path to success that feeds, not crushes, your soul. He is also the co-author of the best-selling books Peak Performance and The Passion Paradox. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and much more. He's also a contributing editor to Outside Magazine. And in his coaching practice, Brad works with executives and entrepreneurs on their performance and well-being. Visit bradstulberg.com for more information. Hey, Brad, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So really interested in your work, especially this book, The Practice of Groundedness. And I want to go through that. But before we get into that material, can you sort of tell our audience like how you even got here? How'd you become a coach? How'd you get involved in mindset and peak performance and all the other things you've written about?
Yeah, I've had a somewhat circuitous path, I guess, to getting here. But when I look back, the pieces end up fitting together somewhat nicely. So I always wanted to be a writer. And I was involved all the way back to like middle school and high school, and the school newspapers, and English and language arts were always my favorite courses. So I applied to a couple of really good journalism schools as a young person, and I didn't get in. And like most young people, I just assumed at that point, all right, I guess I won't be a writer. I'll go do something else. So I studied psychology, sociology, and economics, and I took a job at a consulting firm. And I was always the person that was putting together the presentations or the white papers. So unbeknownst to me at the time, I was basically telling stories and telling nonfiction stories. And that became ultimately my training for both coaching and writing. And one thing led to another. It would take hours to explain, but I naively pitched a bunch of places, various essays that I had really just written for myself. I caught some lucky breaks. A few got published. Generally, with that sort of thing, publishing something begets more publishing. I followed my interests. And really, over about a 10-year period, I transitioned from more of the traditional corporate work to becoming a writer and coach. I always loved the work of both, not only, I guess I should say, just communicating ideas, practices, and principles, but also wrestling with them in the real world. So it was and continues to be important for me to have some skin in the game, which is my coaching practice, but then also to be able to go and really think about these things and try to communicate them in writing as well.
Now, you talk a little bit about it in this book, The Practice of Groundedness, but you mentioned that after Peak Performance became a bestseller and you were drafting The Passion Paradox, or after you'd written it, you were blindsided by obsessive compulsive disorder, or what we call OCD, which is very misunderstood. And I would love to hear about your experience of how you experienced it, because, I think there's different ways it can manifest. And, I think oftentimes we think of like, oh, Howie Mandel, he's a germaphobe, he's OCD, can't touch anything, or the people that, drop a bunch of dominoes onto the floor and they've got to organize them, right? We see these sort of reflected in films, and those are some base level sort of ways it can manifest. But how did it manifest for you? What did it feel like in your brain as you were experiencing it?
I'm so glad that you asked this question. So as you pointed out, I think OCD is so often misrepresented, and by no means in like a malicious or malintentioned way. It's just what's happened. So if you think about, as you said, kind of pop culture references to OCD, there's a lot about being a neat freak or super well organized. And if you looked at my office right now, you would see that I clearly don't fit that bill.
It's a disaster. It's like ground zero.
Exactly. So what OCD actually is it is an intrusive thought or feeling, and often both at the same time, that hits you in a way that feels much more visceral and different than any normal thought or feeling would, accompanied by some kind of compulsion to try to make that thought or feeling go away. So in the case of germ OCD, which is a real thing, the intrusive thought or feeling might be, I've got some microbes on my hands and they're going to infect me and I'm going to get sick and I'm going to give it to my family, and therefore I need to wash my hands. And someone suffering with OCD might have that thought, I don't know, 1,000 times in a given day. And not only are they having that thought, but it's also often associated with just a terrible feeling of like pit in your stomach anxiety. So in my case, as I mentioned, I've never really had an issue with germs. My intrusive thoughts were very much associated with self-harm in the meaning of life. So I constantly became convinced that if I couldn't figure out what the meaning of life is, which there is no actual way to figure that out, you kind of have to make it. But in my brain at the time, I was hell-bent on figuring out this question. And if I couldn't, it very quickly led to, well, then what's the point of being here? Which is a terrible place for your brain to be. My compulsion was to mentally try to figure that out, or to reassure myself that I would never harm myself and that there is meaning to life. So I didn't have any outward compulsion. It was all in my mind. So I'd have the intrusive thought of, well, life is emptiness, so what's the point of being here? And then I'd get terrified that I was going to harm myself. And then I'd start Googling for major depression and suicidal ideation and all these ways that people can harm themselves to try to convince myself that I wouldn't actually do it. This sounds absolutely insane. It is, by definition. It is a serious mental illness. I am so fortunate that I was pretty quickly connected with a wonderful psychiatrist and therapist who specialize in OCD. Because what often happens in these cases are people get misdiagnosed with major depressive disorder. They're often hospitalized, when in fact, as crazy as it sounds, this is a pretty common theme of OCD. So it's not like this is just my brain. Something like 10 to 15% of OCD sufferers actually have the same intrusive thoughts. So trying to figure out the meaning of life, getting worried that they're going to harm themselves. And while I'm not a therapist or a psychiatrist, based on my experience, I can say what separates OCD in this case from like a major depressive disorder is that the person with OCD gets very anxious about this and deep down doesn't want to do it.
Right. They're not really wanting to die is what you're saying. It's just
right.
Thought.
Like being terrified of the thought that like, how could I even have that thought? And then the terror of that thought is what ultimately overtakes you. And as I said, these are not things to mess around with. So if any listeners are experiencing any of this, like the answer is to go find a therapist and or psychiatrist. But hopefully what the book can help do, and certainly this conversation, is just help shed some light on OCD. Because it is so misunderstood. And often the intrusive thoughts are extremely non-accepted by society. So another common theme, I've never had this, is like pedophilia or harming other people. Like you get the thought that I'm just going to push that person into traffic. And then that person becomes scared to leave their house because they're so scared that they're actually going to do it. And as a result, lots of people with OCD never seek help because they are embarrassed or scared to share or ashamed of these thoughts. When in fact, if you go seek information about OCD from any resource that is evidence-based and up to speed, you'll see that it's often these crazy intrusive thoughts that are the most common OCD themes.
That is so excellent. And I'm so glad you clarified that, because from what I'm hearing, it sounds as though I see why it could be missed, because they're thinking that intrusive thought is like depression, or again, like, oh, you're thinking negative things. And you're like, no, it's an intrusive thing. Don't qualify it because I've got OCD, where they're going to miss it because it's not in this sort of classic form we talked about initially. That is a really great way to sum it up. And as you were talking about that intrusive thought about the meaning of life, I was like, yeah, I had that thought too. So I got a philosophy degree. And let me tell you something, it didn't answer any questions. It just gave me way more questions to contemplate. So interesting. And thank you so much for sharing that. And I hope anyone listening, again, please go get some help. And it's your wonderful success story and provide hope for people that have this going on. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and it's highly treatable. I think that's something that's important to know. It is both one of the more debilitating forms of mental illness and most likely to respond to treatment. Right. So there are very concrete evidence-based therapies that just simply work for OCD, both in terms of medication and therapy out in the world. And what's so sad is, again, because the intrusive thoughts are often so vulgar or so out of alignment with how you perceive yourself, people bottle this up inside and they don't get help. I'm very fortunate that, like you, I studied psychology. Like I didn't know what was going on, but I knew that something was wrong in my brain. It was so clear. So it was about 3 days from starting to have these thoughts to ending up in the office of a well-trained psychiatrist. It was, of course, still very hard and very embarrassing to share. But if you're listening and you've been having these thoughts or like you're bottling this stuff up because you're ashamed, it very well could be OCD, which is actually pretty common.
Yeah, no, that's really great. It's sort of dispelling that. And I'm a thyroid expert, as well as, talking about confidence and self-esteem. And when I'm interviewed about thyroid, I always mention, because you get cognitive issues when you don't have enough thyroid hormone. And it's scary because what happens in your brain is you feel like you're getting dumber. You can't remember numbers. You have you're kind of uncoordinated. And the reason I always bring that symptom up versus the classic ones, like, oh, you get fat, you're bloated and, your hair's falling out. Like those are not, to be, tossed away. But just instead of the classic ones, I always talk about the mental things, because when I do, people are like, oh my God, you were describing me, because they're too embarrassed and ashamed. And then they chalk it up to age or something, or they chalk it up to some family thing like, oh, well, my Aunt Mary, she was a recluse. Oh, maybe I'm going in that direction. And you're like, well, maybe Aunt Mary had some undiagnosed stuff going on. Let's not put ourselves in her category. So I always like to bring that up because it is the most embarrassing, weird thing to share with someone. Like, I think something's wrong with my brain. So yeah, thank you so much for that vulnerability and for sharing that and being a champion in that arena for people. And yes, please go get help, everybody, if you're resonating with what Brad is saying. I want to jump into your new book, The Practice of Groundedness. I think something everybody probably needs these days with the advent of technology, social media, and everything else. But one of the things you spoke about in your book, and you were talking about women in this particular arena, where you were talking about that many women report feeling like they must be everything always, continually falling short of some impossible expectations. And you've come to call this heroic individualism, an ongoing game of one-upsmanship against both yourself and others, paired with the limiting belief that measurable achievement is the only arbiter of success. Can you talk to us more? Tell us, what is heroic individualism? How do we spot if maybe we're in this category?
Yeah, so I like to think of heroic individualism as a syndrome that results from kind of getting on that treadmill of constantly feeling like you need to achieve more or accomplish more, or even just do more or be more all the time. And the symptoms that manifest from this tend to be some combination of restlessness, this feeling that is so common and hard to describe, and I'm hopefully helping people give them language for this, which is you both dread having to do more, but the minute that you try to turn it off, you don't know what to do with yourself. So it's almost like this addiction to doing more, even though you don't want to.
Yes.
That leads to a sense of kind of paralysis and discomfort, and ultimately that can become exhaustion. Angst, I mentioned restlessness, a feeling of just like yearning for lasting fulfillment or contentment, a feeling like you don't have like a solid foundation underneath you. So you constantly need the next big project or the next big goal to chase after in order to feel good about yourself. And when you start to have a couple of these things occur, and I think this is really important, you're also pretty successful by conventional standards. That is, to me, screaming this syndrome that I've come to call heroic individualism.
And you talked about how you write what you are longing for, which is what you're pretty sure everyone else is, which is to feel grounded, right? To experience a deeper and more fulfilling kind of success as a result. Let's talk about groundedness. And, I love that you consider it this unwavering internal strength, this self-confidence that sustains you through ups and downs. That's right in line with my book, Confident as Fuck. I'm all about inside and out and having this deep reservoir, as you say, of integrity and fortitude. Let's talk about more about what groundedness means and share that with us.
Yeah, so I love to use two metaphors for this. One is of a tree and one is of nature. Of nature. One is of a mountain. I love to look to nature because I think that, and I know that you dig this too, we are a part of nature. So nature's metaphors tend to really help us understand what's going on with ourselves. So one is of a tree and one is of a mountain. You think about a tree, and I want you to envision like a massive redwood. And when you look up at that tree, you might admire its big, broad overstory. And then perhaps your eye will also be fascinated by the trunk of a tree, big redwood, big, strong trunk. But what very few people recognize or realize or even think in the presence of this big, beautiful, massive tree is its root system. Yet it's the root system that is what's actually holding the tree to the ground. And I make the argument that we're very much like trees. We spend so much time focused on our own metaphorical overstory or our own core and trunk, but we often neglect the very roots that are what is going to hold us to the ground amidst rough weather. So one way to think of groundedness is figuring out what are those roots and how do you water them? Because without those roots, when the wind blows, when it storms, the tree is going to sway back and forth. It's how a lot of us feel right now, and it might even topple. The other analogy or metaphor from nature, as I mentioned, is a mountain. And here, I like to think about climbing a mountain. There are two ways to get to the peak of a mountain. One way is to constantly be obsessing about reaching the peak and worried about what people are going to think of you if you don't, or fantasizing about how everyone's going to love you if you do. The other way to reach the peak of a mountain is to really be present for the journey, to put one foot in front of the other, to be where you are, to enjoy the view from the side, to have fun. And both of these climbers are going to end up at the same destination. They're both going to achieve their goal. They're both going to get the promotion. They're both going to publish the book. They're both going to find their lover, whatever it might be. They're both going to get the new car. But the path to get there, the texture of it is completely different. And what I argue in the book, and what so much research shows, as well as ancient wisdom, that the climber that is enjoying the path and is present and patient on it will be significantly happier, healthier, and more fulfilled. And they'll actually have a better chance of getting where they want to go. So to me, being grounded is about both of those metaphors. It's about being held to the ground amidst rough weather by taking care of things that aren't bright and shiny objects that people often don't see, but are utterly important. And when you do strive for goals, it's about doing so from a place of being present and patient.
Right. And you're saying groundedness, it doesn't eliminate all forms of ambition. It situates and stabilizes these qualities. Can you sort of expand that a little bit?
Yeah, that gets right at the heart of this climber metaphor, right? So it's not about necessarily checking out and going to live in a monastery for 10 years or completely giving up on big projects or achieving goals. It is about selecting those goals and then pursuing them from a place that is in alignment with your core values. And like I said, where you're really present for the path. And as we see all the time, my guess is many of you listeners out there have seen this in yourself, those two ways to get to a goal, they can both be really effective. If you're like super focused on where you want to go, you might achieve that goal, but you'll probably be pretty miserable along the way. So this isn't about eliminating goals. It's not about eliminating ambition or striving. It's about trying to change the texture of the journey so that it's more fulfilling, healthier, and ultimately something that is more fun.
Right. And that goes to sort of a little bit of your conclusion, which is, hey, there's a recurring theme here. If you want to do well and be well in an enduring manner, you need to be grounded, which makes a lot of sense.
Right. Because otherwise you burn out. Like if you're constantly in this, like, I need to get there or else mode of being, that's pretty stressful. It's not very sustainable.
Yeah, I love, let's get into the 6 pillars of groundedness briefly. Let's talk about the first one, which is accept where you are to get to where you want to go. This is so important with presence. And also, even if you believe in the law of attraction or the fact that you can create your future in any type of way through the power of your subconscious mind, then this is really extra important because a lot of people beat themselves up where they are, and then they're really living in the past, aren't they? It's a victim sort of dwelling in what went wrong mode. So let's talk a little bit about accepting where you are to get to where you want to go.
It's one of the hardest things to do, particularly if we're in a challenging situation, which across the whole world over the last, almost 2 years now, I think we've all been. And it is so easy to engage in magical thinking or to delude yourselves or perhaps most common, to try to numb discomfort or a reality that you don't like with substances or with consuming stuff. And while all of those strategies in the short term make you feel better, in the long term, they're extremely detrimental and destructive. And that is because you don't actually do anything to improve your situation if you're not working on the actual thing that needs to be worked on. And often confronting that actual thing and figuring out what it is and seeing it clearly and being honest with yourself about it is really, really hard. But once you've done that, then things start to get a lot easier and a lot better. So one very personal example could be my own diagnosis with OCD. In the moment, it would have been so much easier to try to tell myself, well, maybe I just have some virus and like, if I just take an antibiotic, it'll get better. Or, you know, I can fix this on my own, or I don't need help, or this is certainly going to go away with just a few nights good sleep, whatever it may be. That's great reassurance. And maybe I'll feel better for the hour or two that I'm trying those things. But ultimately, like, it wasn't until I actually said, like, yeesh, my brain is broken right now, I need help fixing it, that I could actually start the path of getting better. And
because the previous things you just said are sort of like denial of the thing that's happening or pushing it away.
Yeah, like
bit, right?
Either repression or denial, or like trying to confront it on like rosy terms.
Right.
And I think that we're all getting like a real good, I don't know if good's the right word, but real thorough practice with this with COVID. I mean, I certainly lived in a geography where in June or July, COVID was effectively zero. Case numbers were super low. It was basically back to normal. And then this Delta variant comes.
Yeah, that was a pain in the ass.
Kicking the balls. I'm a guy, so I can say that. So many people, myself included at first, like we were in denial about it. Oh, this can't be happening. Or like, maybe it's just a blip in the numbers. Or there was like a repression or a pushing back against it. And it wasn't until we accepted what was happening that we could then like rearrange our lives, set appropriate expectations, and do our best to get on with the show. And in a nutshell, that's what acceptance is. And I think that acceptance often gets confused for passive resignation or like phoning it in or giving it up. But I argue it's actually like the brave, confident thing to do, because again, you can't actually take productive action on something if you don't identify what the real thing is.
So key, so key. And this leads right into sort of the second pillar of be present so you can own your attention and energy. So if you're not present, right, then you are going to, again, keep rosy colored glasses away your issues that are happening on the inside. So why don't you elaborate on the be present part, pillar?
Yeah. So in the simplest terms, being present is just being where you are. A kind of pithier way to say it is, particularly if you're goal oriented, is like you have to be here to get there. And in today's world, there are so many distractions and areas of novelty and stimulation that are fighting for our attention and that are often taking it away from the more meaningful things in our life. So the metaphor that I use in the book is one of peanut M&Ms and brown rice. And just bear with me here. I promise this will make sense. So peanut M&Ms taste freaking wonderful. And if you have a bowl of peanut M&Ms or a bowl of brown rice in front of you, and you're anything like me, you're going to choose the peanut M&Ms. And for the first 10, 15, 20 minutes, eating peanut M&Ms is going to make you feel great.
I'm going to get a nice dopamine hit on that one. Yeah.
Yeah. If you eat peanut M&Ms though, for an hour or a day or a week or a month, or God forbid a year, you're going to feel like shit. Whereas if you eat brown rice for a day, a week, a month, a year, and there's nothing particular about brown rice, I'm using brown rice as a stand-in for a wholesome natural food, you're going to feel great. And the same thing is true with how we spend our time and energy out in the world. So the brown rice in our life are meaningful relationships, our kids, our romantic partners, our close friends, meaningful work, the big creative projects we want to do, meaningful hobbies, exercise, gardening, art, sculpting, craft. The peanut M&Ms, Twitter, Instagram, God forbid, CNN.com, all these kind of like quick hits. And those quick hits, they feel a lot better in the moment that you do them, but ultimately they leave you feeling sick if that's all that you do. So
or keep searching for the next hit. Which
the next hit, exactly,
yeah.
to like keep you satiated, because none of it's really nourishing. So it's kind of like junk food, right? There's so much junk content, and if that's what we consume, we're going to feel like crap. So like this whole principle is about how do you figure out what is the brown rice in your life versus the peanut M&Ms. And then, because as we talked about, willpower is really, really hard to muster. How do you just try to design your life as best as you can so that you don't have peanut M&Ms everywhere? And this might be taking apps off your phone. It might be scheduling time for deep presence in work or play where your computer is nowhere near you. Or if you're working on a computer, you might disable your email client for an hour and a half. So it's trying to kind of identify, again, this dichotomy between things that are meaningful and ultimately fulfill you, but at first are not nearly as fun or easy as the novelty and distraction. And then setting up practices to choose those meaningful things.
Yeah. And you can start off with baby steps. Maybe it's like, if you're addicted to the phone, you put it on silent and turn it over for, put an hour timer. I mean, if it's that bad, then maybe it starts there. There's simple ways to build this up. I totally agree with this. We are so overstimulated by technology, and I think have gotten away from enjoying our own company and our own thoughts, which I think is really important, which in a way, I believe the pandemic sort of brought people to that come to Jesus kind of situation with themselves, because they couldn't go out into the world to be stimulated by external things. And I think that this has been a game changer for a lot of people, right? People are realizing, ooh, life is short, or, I don't like the job that I'm in, and making some changes. So there's been some almost forced presence, I think, a little bit, and forced awareness during this time.
Yep, 100%. And it's been hard because, much like coming off of like eating peanut M&Ms all the time, you kind of crave it when it's gone. Anyone that's tried to like minimize their cell phone use knows that feeling of wanting to reach for your cell phone all the time. And like any addiction, there's generally a period where things get worse before they get better. But you just have to commit yourself to getting through that period. And then ultimately you develop like a craving for the brown rice in your life, no different than with nutrition. And it becomes a lifestyle. And are there times when you might get out of that lifestyle? Absolutely. I mean, I'm launching a book right now. I am spending way too much time on my email, on social media, on various other apps than I would ever want to. And I feel like crap most of the time as a result. But now that I know this, it can be like, all right, I'm doing this for 2 weeks. Then I'm going to basically go through like a 1 to 2 week withdrawal, but then I'm going to start feeling better. And just knowing that helps you get through that withdrawal period.
Yeah. Knowing there's a little bit of a vacation on the other end, and a forced one is the way to do it. The third or fourth, I forget where we are now, but this is one of my favorite ones, because this was really the key to me being confident as fuck, which is sort of inside and out as I describe it in my book. But I had sort of been confident in all these areas of my life, except for one area over here that I was shuffling under the rug, where, I have a permanent sort of physical disability that you can't see. It's fine. No one should feel sorry for me. I live a great life, 99% pain-free, but I was injured 22 years ago and sustained this, hand-arm injury. And I had such shame about it because, I'm alpha, and I just could not be vulnerable about this. I didn't share it, and it really screwed up romantic relationships and some other areas of my life. In fact, I do a speech called The Shame of Disability and the Disability of Shame, because the shame was more disabling than the damn disability, Brad. And I realized what a strength it was to embrace vulnerability, to develop genuine strength and confidence, as you say, for one of the pillars that also, of course, allowed me to show up even more authentically. I was already authentic. I was coaching people. I was doing great with all these areas, but I had this thing in the background that I had to deal with. And what a relief when I finally did. I mean, I can't, it's funny when you look back on your old non-vulnerable self and you're like, wow, you really did a number. You did a number. Yeah, exhausting. You did a number on yourself. So I love that. And obviously we can tell already in this interview, you are willing to be vulnerable and open. Even talking about now how doing press for your book and stuff. Okay. It's not real fun right now. You gotta
no, it's icky.
That
That's the word I use. I mean, you've launched books, you know how it is. It's like, why do we do this stuff? Unless you're like a total narcissistic psychopath, the main driver for doing this stuff is because you love the work and it's interesting and it's creative and you get to maybe help people and you meet interesting people. But then once every few years when you launch something new, well, especially in this day and age, like you have to be your own publicist. So the whole job becomes marketing and self-promotion. and you're just eating candy all the time. So yeah, you do feel like crap. So yeah, I'm with you there.
Well, but I love this, the truth about, right, being authentic is, first of all, it reigns supreme. It really does. That's why we are attracted to confident people, because we sort of trust them about themselves. But being real with yourself and others, if you're not, then you're sort of sliding into that people-pleasing category, right? Which is just a mess. Oh, what a mess. Might as well just stab yourself in the stomach with a katana sword right now, because it leads into passive-aggressive behavior, covert contracts, when you are out there saying things you truly don't believe and mean because you're scared of what someone might say, or you're thinking you might get rejected, or you're doing it so that someone will like you. And then there's that false sense of self, and you're out there and you don't really trust people because you've put a false version of yourself forward. So let's talk about vulnerability and being authentic.
So one of my favorite quotes on this, and this is included in the book, it comes from the poet Maria Rainer Rilke. And he writes, "I want to unfold, for where I am folded, there I am a lie." And I love this quote so much because to me, it means that the areas in our own lives that we fold over, that we, physically, when you think about those things, you want to like hunch down and curl up. Those are the areas where we don't really know ourselves, and where we don't let others really know ourselves. Mm-hmm. And those areas are lies. And until we can unfold and learn that about ourselves first, and then with specific others, share, we cannot have true, deep, trusting relationships. And you mentioned like people pleasing with others. I often think that just as bad as people pleasing with yourself. Yeah. So not being honest with yourself about your perceived weaknesses, which, by the way, we're all humans. Like, you studied philosophy. We're all at some level, probably, unless you're uber religious, pretty scared that you're going to die, wanting to feel perfectly known, even though that's impossible, and wanting to both be relevant as an individual, but loved by others. So like, these are the human condition. You are not alone in feeling these things. But if you can't explore them, then you'll never fully trust all of yourself. And no one else will ever fully trust you. And you won't develop those deep relationships because you'll only be kind of connecting on a superficial level. So what I found in researching and writing this book is that the path to real, deep, lasting, non-performative vulnerability is first to do the work with yourself, so that you can become more confident and trust yourself. And then when it comes to building community and developing strong bonds with others, to take that level of vulnerability with them. There's a really interesting study in the book. It was from the University of Mannheim in Germany. And researchers had two people have direct one-on-one distraction-free conversations. And they instructed one of the people to be super vulnerable. So talking about periods of mental illness or divorce or the loss of a child or their greatest fears. And the person doing the vulnerable sharing after the conversation rated themselves as weak. But the person on the receiving end that was listening rated that person as strong, admirable, respected that person, and wanted to talk to them more. Yeah. So that's the paradox of vulnerability. When we're doing it, it can feel really uncomfortable, but we're actually perceived as so much stronger. Something that another wonderful vulnerability researcher, Brene Brown, writes is that trust doesn't, like, you don't have to trust someone to be vulnerable with them. You have to be vulnerable with them, and then they'll trust you and you can trust them. Now, this isn't everyone. Like, we all have assholes in our life. And for those people, I fold up like crazy because I don't want to let them in. And I try to minimize my contact with them. But for those that are closest to us or that we want to be close with, if we can push ourselves to be more vulnerable, I argue that we'll have a greater success at finding deep connection. And this is true both with intimate relationships as well as close friends.
Let's talk a little bit in this vulnerability area, where you mentioned in your book that when you first started coaching, this was sort of a significant concern. You felt a sense of imposter syndrome. And you would go meet with clients and thinking like, what could I possibly teach this person? Wait till they find out who I really am. What were you afraid they would find out about you that would
the
make
same
them
thing that
reject
everyone, right? I'm making it up as I go. And that's all of us. And that's like the other thing. But yeah, I'm so glad that you asked this question. So what might they find out? That like, I don't have all this stuff figured out for myself. Well, no shit, no one does. That's, for a long time, I thought like, I don't have a PhD. Like my highest level of education is a master's. And I, like with my own coach and therapist, I'm like, do I need a PhD? And she's like, no, like what you need is to like accept that like you don't need a PhD.
Exactly.
Like carry that vulnerability with you. Why don't you practice what you preach? So there's nothing major, but it's the same stuff as everyone. Like the true experts, I've learned this, rarely feel like they're true experts. And anyone that says that they have it all figured out is the exact person to run the opposite direction from.
Yes.
But it took me a while to really understand that because I thought that I had to have it all figured out.
Well, and this goes to, I guess, a little bit of the whole like this is a terrible quote, right? Those who can't teach kind of thing. I sort of disagree on that a little bit because I've had some amazing teachers that maybe were not quote unquote successful or prominent in the field of which they were teaching in, but what they gave, they were no doubt an expert, right? Their knowledge was so valuable. And I guess that's sort of a little bit of that, right? They might feel imposter syndrome, right?
Yeah. And I think that it's important to remember again, that everyone does. And this is also based on a lot of good research that's just been published over the last 5 years. But if you don't feel any imposter syndrome, that's more cause for concern than if you do feel some. Now, being overwhelmed with imposter syndrome and self-doubt, that is not helpful. But feeling a little bit is basically the same thing as having some humility. And it's often the people that feel zero imposter syndrome that end up like the Andrew Cuomos and the Donald Trumps of the world.
I always feel like I never understood that imposter syndrome so much, but I do get that part of, yes, there are like, I don't feel it strongly. And I've never really understood it, but because in the areas that I'm an expert in, I feel very confident in, but again, truly, that doesn't mean that I'm not still without some struggles here. I may be able to get them over quicker than someone just studying it or learning or adopting it. Right. So yeah, there is still that human element of like, hey, I'm not perfect, but here's what I have to offer. And hopefully it'll help you. And that vulnerability right there is what I think, yeah, you're talking about. On this same note, let's get into, I just love the term emotional flexibility, and in the health arena, we talk about metabolic flexibility and how important that is. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, tell us what you mean by emotional flexibility and how we might be able to adopt that or, live that.
Yeah. So emotional flexibility is the skill to be able to hold two competing emotions in short succession or even at the same time. So to be able to go from being absolutely sad or despairing about something terrible to smiling and enjoying a wonderful home-cooked meal or time with a loved one. And I think that what happens so often now is lots of people, and certainly like the mainstream culture, gets hooked on one of those two extremes and struggles to move between the two or be in the middle. So I feel like right now there are so many people that are just completely stuck in like despair all the time. And there's a lot to be despairing about and a lot to be sad about, but certainly not everything in the world is despair. There are also people that are like Pollyanna and like always like positive, everything's great. Well, that's not so much true either. In any given day, for most people, the pendulum swings between happiness and sadness, despair and hope, joy and fatigue, energy and exhaustion. And to be able to hold all of these things without getting too attached or without over-identifying with any of them is a superpower. And that superpower is what researchers call emotional flexibility.
I love it. And then let's jump on the last two. Build deep community. This is really important. As an ancestral health expert, that's finding your tribe is really important. And even if you only have, research shows, even if you only have like one person or you feel some connection, we need that as human beings. So how can we build deep community? And I guess you would say we have to prioritize it.
Mm-hmm. And you would know this, like you said, better than anyone, that we as a species evolved to be in bands or tribes of anywhere between 10 and 150 people on average. We did not evolve to be alone, and we did not evolve to be connected globally. And right now, I think so many people are feeling alone because they're is such a pressure to be efficient or to quote unquote optimize. And when you are super efficient and when you optimize everything, what often gets crowded out is time and energy spent for building deep community. Because building deep community is inherently inefficient. It takes time. You often don't get immediate rewards. It is often in direct opposition to pushing forward in the short term. In the long term, having strong, deep community is like jet fuel. It will make you better at what you do. It will help you achieve your goals. It will make you more resilient. And when you fail, it will be there to catch you. But in the short term, none of that stuff happens because it takes a lot of time. And I think we've become so uber focused on, like I said, optimization and efficiency that we've lost time for community. So how does this manifest in like day to day? Well, it's simple. Instead of meeting up with someone in person, you do Zoom. Instead of a Zoom, you do a phone call. Instead of a phone call, it's a quick text message. Instead of a quick text message, it's a group email. And particularly with COVID, where it's become more complex to meet with people in a way that is safe, especially in the beginning of the pandemic before vaccines. I feel like community really got crowded out. And now so many people are feeling lonely and isolated because of that. So much of this book, right, is taking a long-term view, not a short-term view. And I think if your long-term view is fulfillment, happiness, health, success, then building community should be an utmost priority. But it requires getting out of this short-term mode of I need to do more work today.
Yeah. And, I was interviewing Brad Thor, the #1 New York Times bestselling author, and he mentioned, and I forget who it was, who said that what really ruined everyone was air conditioning. Because, back in the day, we would go out on our porch, we'd talk to people, right? We're sitting outside, we're, hanging out, we're starting conversations with people. I love that in your book, you mentioned that old school salon idea. I actually have an older client who did this for many years in San Francisco and would hold these sort of salons, like very old school, very sort of French, right? kind of situation. Mm-hmm. And I love that. I do think as well, one of the benefits of the pandemic with Zoom, and even though it's not in person, it was nice. I'd been on a text thread with people I've known since I was 7. We never got on a Zoom to look at each other, and so the pandemic, it was like, oh, hey, we should Zoom. We're all home. We're all bored, mm-hmm. And it was really nice. It was really nice. And in a way, I'm FaceTiming more with my parents and things like that, where we were like, why didn't we do this before? To begin with.
And these are tools where I argue with, you said Brad Thor, right? Where I'd push back against Brad, and my guess is we're agreeing. And
well, he was quoting another author. It wasn't his opinion, but yeah.
Yeah. And my guess is from what I know, he'd agree with me on this. But what I'd say is that these are tools, and we need to put boundaries and constraints around tools. So air conditioning is great. But if air conditioning stops you from going out on the porch and meeting your neighbors, that is a big harm that then you need to have some kind of constraint to work against. Social media, we would not be having this wonderful conversation, which I'm so much enjoying, if it wasn't for social media and the internet. So it's not all bad, but if you spend your entire day on social media and the internet, then it becomes harmful. So, back to emotional flexibility, it's this non-dual thinking. And I think so many modern tools, we overshoot the target and we don't realize the potential negative effects. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last one, which I'm down for, of course, is move your body to ground your mind, right? Regularly moving your body so that you can fully inhabit it, as you say, connect it to your mind. And as a result, you're going to become more firmly situated wherever you are. So I really believe in this. And, I'm a regular exerciser, but it's less about trying to achieve some outward goal and more about how it really makes me feel and my mind work and my emotions and everything else. And of course, yes, it's great for longevity and, anti-aging. But wow, I mean, I live in the middle of the mountains, and so I'm a nature person, and I feel so grounded when I'm moving, especially out in nature, but in any way that I can do it, it helps me. So how can we convince more people that this is something they need to start?
Yeah. So I think that there's a few misconceptions about movement. And I love how you called it movement, not exercise. I'm also pretty, I think that's important. Because exercise has this negative connotation, for better or worse. And people hear exercise, they think of sweating on an elliptical trainer. What do you look like in the mirror? Do my clothes from last year fit? And I fall into the category of there's nothing wrong with having goals of weight loss or having clothes that fit. That's all fine. But I really think those should be like secondary goals. When the first goal should be like to feel strong and confident in your body, whatever it is, and to get all the benefits of movement that are so far beyond the aesthetic. Mm-hmm. So the mood benefits, the emotional benefits, the creativity benefits, the benefits of being outdoors away from screens. And I just wish that we would spend more time focusing on that is the motivation to move, not a number on a scale. And again, if you're someone that's overweight or obese, having that number on a scale go down is a wonderful thing. But the research shows that for most people, that can't be a primary driver if a movement practice is to be sustainable. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is that when we are moving in our bodies, we are also engaging our brain in ways that it's not normally engaged. We have to you know all this stuff, but I'll say it for listeners. We have to use parts of our brain that modulate body temperature as it's changing fast, that are in control of like neuromuscular connection between our hands, our feet, our cores. And I have a strong hypothesis that this is why movement is so connected with preventing Alzheimer's and other cognitive decline. So researchers don't know the mechanism. They don't know how it works, but they're absolutely confident that movement is the best way to prevent Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. And one hypothesis, it's not just mine, but it's the one that I hold most closely, is that when we move, not only are we getting increased oxygen and blood flow to our brain, but we're also engaging our brain in very full, whole ways that we don't otherwise do when we're sitting around.
Absolutely. Dr. Brant Courtwright, who is a brain researcher, I've interviewed him a couple of times on the old podcast. And yeah, he says the same thing and says, listen, even if it's just 30 minutes of slow walking, but anything you can do for 30 minutes or even 40 minutes, the time is related to the benefits as well. And, I'm sure you feel the same way. Sometimes, you have an issue or you're stuck in your head, just going for a walk. Wow. It broadens the perspective. You're looking around you. It sort of pans the camera out. At least that's how I feel in nature. I've, been in a certain mode or way of thinking or mood and then taken a walk. And then, wow, has that really clarified things for me versus just sitting there, dwelling and simmering in it.
Yeah, it's like the best quick fix, if there is such a thing, for being stuck. And that can be emotionally, as you just alluded to, but it could also be cognitively. So if you're stuck on a problem, if you're a writer trying to edit a sentence and you can't figure it out, or if you're a programmer trying to code, or you're in finance and the spreadsheet's not working, the best thing that you can do is go move your body and come back to it. Second best thing you can do is sleep and come back to it. Simple, but not easy. I mean, that's groundedness in a nutshell. Like, these are such transformative practices. They are not complex. I actually think there's so much complex stuff out there that doesn't work. They're simple, but they're not easy. And that's why such a big part of what I tried to hold myself to in writing this book is closing what I call the knowing doing gap. Mm-hmm. So it's one thing to know these principles. It's another thing to do them and to practice them. And you need knowing, that's the foundation, but then you also want to be able to lift these things off the page and actually apply them in your life. And that's why practice is so, so important. I argued with my publisher, Get Grounded would have been a much sexier title. I said, no, it needs to be the practice of groundedness because all of this stuff is an ongoing practice.
Yeah. And last but not least, I really like that you touched on the Danes, who are actually considered the happiest people in the world. And this is a topic I've kind of brought up a couple of times because my stepfather is from Denmark. He doesn't have a bad day. I've never seen the guy have a bad day. And one of the reasons, and you kind of mentioned it, well, they say about the Danes is that they're happier partially because they don't have expectations. But people would misinterpret that and say, well, what do you mean? You ask someone to go fix your car, they don't, you pay them the money, they rip you off, and you're just okay with that. That's not really what they mean. The way that I've observed it with my stepdad is when expectations fall apart or you have an expectation and it goes wrong, they're very quick to pivot. They don't wallow in it. They don't. I've seen it like live with my stepfather, and I gotta say, it's pretty amazing. So, what would be a normally stressful situation for an American might not be for a Dane, based on, and again, there's lots of cultural things that contribute to that. But it's very interesting to watch. And one of the examples is they were, my parents drove 2 hours to get on a ship for a cruise, and my mother forgot his visa information, like at home. And most people would have had a meltdown, probably, blamed her, maybe made some snide remarks. He was like, well, whatever, I'll drive back and get it. And if for some reason I don't make it back in time, I'll fly to meet you at, in St. Bart's or wherever they were going. And he just was, it was again, like just a quick pivot. It was not, and he made it back, but never said a word about it. Just completely, again, that is so advanced, right? Like that I would just look at him in awe sometimes. But that is a lot of what they say as to why the Danes are the happiest people, based on this sort of not low expectation, but I guess when something's not met, the ability to pivot and not wallow in it.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that acceptance again is like such a big part of that too. Right.
Right.
And the Danes are really good at not setting expectations. So often this research gets played up as they have really low expectations. But I think like when you actually peel back the onion, it's that they don't have expectations at all. It's just like, this is what's happening right now. What's the point of an expectation? This is what's in front of me. And that combines acceptance and presence. So of course, Danes tend to be really grounded. We could all learn from them.
Yeah. And it reminds me of, sort of Byron Katie, which is like loving what is, the acceptance of what's happening now, and that we suffer when we struggle with reality, right? With the truth of the situation. And she would say, well, you have to love what is. And I think, yeah, they probably do. And we have a lot to learn from them. I think that research is so interesting on happiness, and I've seen it in action. So as we wrap up, first of all, we can get your book almost everywhere, but tell us how we can connect more with you. We'll put everything in the show notes, but give us your website. Let us know how we can work with you. Do you work one-on-one with clients? Do you also provide other forms of coaching? Give us, how we can benefit more from your work and your expertise.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. So the book is available everywhere books are sold: Amazon, independent bookshops, Barnes and Nobles, you name it. My website is just my name with a .com at the end. So www.bradstulberg.com. And there's more information about the work that I do with organizations as well as coaching. And I know we're recording this a little bit before the podcast will drop, so it's hard to say if I'll have openings in my coaching practice, but if not, I work with colleagues that I would trust with, my own mind. And I'm always happy to make referrals if I'm not the right fit or if I don't have opening.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with on this subject of the practice of groundedness?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think the last thing is to really and it gets back to emotional flexibility and non-dual thinking, is for all of this stuff. So if you pick up the book and you read it and you're like, this is great, these practices are concrete, I can do them, but then you fail. Because of course you're going to fail. You're trying to make change. It's very, very hard to make change. It's so important to have some self-compassion. And I think in this kind of genre that you and I exist in, there are like these two polar extremes. There's the self-discipline, wake up at 4 a.m, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, take responsibility extreme. And there is the self-love, hold hands, sing kumbaya extreme. And those two things work best when you combine them. So doing hard things is hard. And that's why self-compassion is really important. But doing hard things is also necessary because change is hard. So if you get the book and you practice it, and this is in the book, really think of yourself as having fierce self-discipline, but also having fierce self-compassion. And you put those two things together, you'll go far.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for all the work that you do and for coming on to chat with us today. And hope to see you again at some point in the future.
Yeah, thanks for having me and for the wonderful conversation.
All right, and everyone else, we'll see you next week.
Hey listeners, over the years, a ton of companies have approached me to collaborate, but I will only promote companies whose products I believe in and that I actually use and consume on a regular basis. So let me tell you about some of my favorite companies that I can offer you discounts for. Rep Provisions, an amazing company doing incredible things for our planet, topsoil, and animals with regenerative agriculture. And it's my #1 source for quality pasture-raised meat and chicken. Visit repprovisions.com and use code L15 for 15% off. I'm also obsessed with a company called Carnivore Crisps. They make a lean, all-natural, and delicious alternative to conventional snacking, made with just real meat and real salt. Totally addictive, and my favorite ones are the beef brisket and the ribeye. Visit carnivorecrisps.com and use code PALEO10 for 10% off. I also love and regularly use Paleo Valley products. They make amazing supplements and delicious paleo products. I use the superfood greens powder, grass-fed beef sticks, the organ complex, and their bone broth bars. I love the lemon and apple. I also use their essential C complex and more. Visit paleovalley.com/promos/Elle Russ for 15% off. I also love Primal Kitchen. They make delicious paleo-approved, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and no refined sugar products, and I use them daily, from their collagen powders and sauces and marinades to their avocado and olive oil. So good, so healthy. Visit primalkitchen.com and use code L10 for 10% off. I also love paleo powder and use it almost on everything I cook. They make incredible seasoning blends, and they also have these incredible grain-free coatings that feel just like crispy breadings that you would have had prior to knowing that there's another way. So visit paleopowder.com and use code L15 for 15% off.